for the singing of our national anthem. Welcome. As tomorrow is Veterans Day 2023, we commemorate it today. Thank you for your attendance, for being here this morning. I would appreciate, and thank you, Apollo, for the singing of our national anthem. I'd like for you to please join me in prayer. If you please bow with me. Dear Lord, today we honor our veterans, worthy men and women who gave their best when they were called upon to serve and protect their country. We pray that you will bless them for their unselfish service and the continual struggle to preserve our freedoms, our safety, and our country's heritage for us all. Bless them abundantly for their hardships they faced, for their sacrifices they made. We respect them, thank them, and honor them. We pray that you will watch over our veterans and their families and bless them with peace and happiness. Amen. Now ask Martha Leando to come.
Good morning. At this time, I'd like to ask all current and former United States military veterans to please stand to be recognized. On behalf of King University and the Student Veterans Association, we thank you for your service. I'd now ask Dr. Kelly Vaughan to please come to the podium.
So it's not every day that you get to introduce your father as the keynote speaker for Veterans Day. So it's my privilege to introduce to you Tom Vaughan. He's a retired senior principal systems engineer from Raytheon Corporation, a former specialist 5th class with the 18th Engineering Brigade, who served 2.5-year tour in Vietnam, for which he was awarded a Bronze Star, Joint Services Commendation Medal, other awards, and as he notes, not one for good behavior. He's also a farmer, he is a father, he's a living historian, and most importantly, he'll tell you his best title is his Bapal to his grandchildren. Over the years, Dad has taught us many lessons, and I just want to share a few with you. He started his college career here at King in pre-engineering track, took classes with Ed Burke. President Liston was serving as our president at the time, and he was here when the new, not so new, Student Center, Klein, was being built. And he tells a story of when he was here, he played too much ping pong and he almost failed out of his classes. So one of the lessons was, your grades do not define you. Dad is one of the smartest people I know, and I don't just say that because he's my father. He also taught me a lesson for what another story from his time at King is. He and other students that were commuting were on campus, and this was early in the morning, and it was snowing, and none of the buildings were unlocked. So Dad stood out in the middle of the road and found some administrator, probably President Liston, and stopped them and said, something needs to be done. The commuters need a safe, warm place to be in the early morning. So after that, there were several buildings that were unlocked early in the morning. So Dad taught us to be stand up for yourself and others, to be a leader, and grades don't define you. His career at Raytheon may have come to an end when I was in many of your shoes as a senior in college when Raytheon and Bristol shut down. But Dad had gained a reputation as the go-to fixer. He says his job was to make his bosses look good. They created a title for him, that senior systems blah, 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 that nobody understood what it was. But basically, he's the one that went across the country, worked in 15 states over the next period of his career for several decades, working on problems and fixing other people's problems, involved in some of the missile defense system and other things he's just now starting to be able to talk about because it's coming out of security clearance. He has lots of stories to tell. So the lesson from that is find what you are good at, excel at it, and that will become your vocation, and others will recognize you for it. Dad is now a living historian. He doesn't fit in his Vietnam War era uniform. This is his Revolutionary War era uniform. He is not that old. He is a representative from the Over-Mountain Victory Trail Association for the Revolutionary War that was fought in this area, and he will tell you some more about that. Our family farm is pre-Revolutionary War era. We've been in this area for a long time, and we have ancestors that fought in the Revolutionary War in the Battle of Kings Mountain. Dad and the OVTA have educated hundreds of thousands of children and adults over the past decade on the importance of keeping the story alive. And so if Dad taught us anything, it's the importance of knowing what and telling your story, recognizing others and sharing their stories so that we can keep their memories alive. With that, please join me in welcoming my father, Tom Vaughan, as our speaker today.
I told her if she did too bad of a job, that I would beat her over the head and shoulders with my sword, which was a common event in the 18th century. Now, for you folk in the back, I recognize you because that's where I used to sit during the convocations also, as far back as I could get. I'm not that scary, maybe, most of the time. Our family association with King and our church association with King goes back. Anybody ever heard of James King and Reverend Tadlock, the founder of King College and the first president? Well, they were ministers at our church, Cold Spring Presbyterian, while they were here at King University. So our church has been intimately involved. Have you ever heard of the King football team? Not the round one that people run around and kick with their feet. 1896, my great-grandfather was on the football team. I haven't found it yet, but in 1897, when he should have still been here, can't find the roster, they played the University of Tennessee at King University, or King College. Unfortunately, King lost that one. I was, shall I say, in the words of a former president, here at King, I was not the best student. I got, as Kelly said, an occasional Mercy C, which I was thankful for. But I know you all do far better than that, don't you? Somebody nod your head up and down. But do you know who the most important person I'd met? Of course, Mr. Jordan, Mr. Burke. Dr. Burke was one of my professors. But do you know who one of the most important people that I met here? How many of you have heard of Jewel Bell? Yes. And I went to school here with their son, Lawrence. And I'm that old. Well, what I came today to tell you about is a quote, and I'll use that as the entrance to this. We sleep soundly in our beds because rough men stand ready in the night to do violence on those who would wish to harm you. That's a fairly recent quote. It's been attributed to Winston Churchill. It's been attributed to George Orwell. It is probably somebody we have never heard of, L.K. Dallas. But both Orwell and Churchill used it, and it was based on Rudyard Kipling's poem. I went into a public. The girls behind the bar, they laughed and giggled a fit to die. Oh, making mock of the uniform that guards you while you sleep. A lot of us Vietnam veterans saw that when we came back from Vietnam. But I'm going to tell you about earlier rough men that came from right here in this community on this, from what was Sapling Grove at that time, now Bristol. How many of you have heard of George Washington? How many of you have heard of Clinton? Now, how many historians are in here? I know there's one sitting right there. Sir Lord Henry Clinton was the head of the British Army in the colonies. He and George Washington had fought to a standstill in the Revolutionary War. Neither one was strong enough to take on the other. For a year and a half, 2 years, the Americans had not had a victory until the war came to the South, called the Southern Campaign, where Charlestown fell to Lord Clinton in May 1780. In August 1780, Charlestown, we lost an entire Southern Continental Army, somewhere 6,000 men. Hero of Saratoga, Gates, was sent south to form an army. He bumped into Cornwallis at a place called Camden in August 1780. He lost. He saw his army being beaten. He climbed on his horse and ran. Some of those rough men, General DeKalb, would not retreat until they received an order to retreat. Gates was gone and gave no order to retreat. DeKalb was hacked to death with 13 sword strikes. Our second entire Southern Continental Army, gone. There was no more organized resistance. Cornwallis was to come in behind. Washington. Clinton would come out of New York and catch Washington, hammer and anvil, and crush the American Revolution. There was nothing standing in the way until those rough men from right here received a threat from across the mountain. Cornwallis had two commanders. One, Bannister Tarleton. How many of you have ever seen the movie The Patriot? A lot of you. Taverton was built somewhat around Tarleton. Tarleton's nickname was Bloody Ban. He earned it at the Battle of the Waxhaws, south of Charlotte, where after General Davidson surrendered his army, Tarleton's men bayoneted over 200 prisoners. Cornwallis's other commander was Patrick Ferguson, a brilliant Scots inventor, invented a breech-loading, flintlock black powder rifle that I have seen fired by a moving soldier 7 times in a minute. He thought that a lot of the populace would be loyal to the king if they were treated properly. And he recruited over 3,000 men from right across the mountains. But he did not like us over here because we were not supposed to be here. This territory had been ceded to the Indians by the British for their help in the French and Indian War. Now, the settlers that came in here had made their own treaties with the Cherokee, had leased the land, and had come to an agreement, fairly peaceable agreement with the natives for use of the land. Well, the British were trying to drive us out. And I'm going to do this from the perspective of my great-great-grandfather, John Pemberton, who was in the militia under the Shelbys. And if you have ever read any of the historic signs, they were right here. Their fort, if you know where Weaver's funeral home is, right over there. Ferguson sent a threat across the mountain that unless we, the inhabitants of this area, laid down our arms, pledged allegiance to the King of England, he was going to march his army over that mountain and lay waste our lands with fire and sword. Now, Colonel Shelby sent a message to me and the rest of the captains to gather our men, to muster our men. We gathered, and we got our orders. Gathered Sycamore Shoals, September 25th, 1780. And we left. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever tried driving cattle before, a herd of cattle. It's almost like driving a herd of students somewhere. They go everywhere. That lasted one day. We sent our food back because that was our food supply. Our commanders keep us informed of what was going on. We started riding. Rainy day like this, it rained on us, and it rained, and it rained. We started climbing the mountains, and we got to the top of the mountain, Yellow Mountain Gap, and the rain had stopped. September 27th, snow was shoe-mouth deep. Took a rest. That night, several of us sat down. We had not made our wills out. We wrote our wills, sent them back home with messengers, because we had word that Ferguson was at Cathay's plantation. We thought we might meet him the next day. Went to Cathay's plantation. He was gone. We met at McDowell's house, Quaker Meadows. Now, Ms. McDowell was a very generous lady. She sent her folk out in the mountains where she had hidden the cattle from the British because the British had stripped the land of all sustenance. She brought the cattle in. It was still raining. She let us take down the top rail of her split rail fence. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever made split rail fences, but they're a lot of work to make. I don't like doing it. She let us use those for firewood because that was the only dry firewood we had. We were joined there by Colonel Cleveland and 400 of militia out of Surrey County. The next morning, October the 1st, we rode out. And here I just want to read you. We found a broadside that Patrick Ferguson wrote on October the 1st as we were when we left. We found it that evening posted. And this just gives you an idea of the opinion that he had of us over mountain men. Recruiting brochure. Gentlemen, and this is to the populace in the Piedmont area of the Carolinas, unless you wish to be eat up by an inundation of barbarians who have begun by murdering an unarmed son before his aged father and afterwards lopped off his arms, and who by their shocking cruelties and irregularities give the best proof of their cowardice and want of discipline. Now, he was talking about me. I say, if you wish to be pinioned, robbed, and murdered, and see your wives and daughters in 4 days abused by the dregs of mankind, in short, if you wish to deserve to live and bear the name of men, grasp up your arms in a moment and run to my camp. We also had a rather low opinion of Major Ferguson. After that threat, he should have known better than to send that threat over the mountains to us. We hunkered down for 3 days. We had intelligence he was at a place called Gilberttown. The heavens opened up and drowned everything for 3 days. Later records show that it was probably a Category 5 hurricane that landed and drenched the Carolinas. We didn't have tents. We had our hunting shirts and a blanket. We huddled under trees and waited. We missed Ferguson at Gilberttown. Hadn't had anything to eat then by about 2 days. Heard he was going to this place in South Carolina called Fort 96. Well, we took off. We made it to Alexander's Ford when in the middle of the night there was a big ruckus. We thought a spy had ridden into the camp. My men drug him off the saddle, off his horse. He convinced us that he was Colonel Lacey of the South Carolina militia, so we took him to our commanders, to Shelby, Sevier, McDowell, Campbell from up here in Southwest Virginia. He said, I've captured one of Ferguson's messengers. He's not headed toward 96. He is headed toward Cornwallis's lines on the Charlottetown Pike. The men that were able, the morning of October the 6th, hadn't had anything to eat in several days, climbed in our saddles, and we rode 28 miles to a place called Cowpens. Belonged to a British loyalist, and he would gather up cattle from all over the region, fatten them up, and then drive them up to Philadelphia and sell them. He was kind enough to let us have some of his cattle for supper because we were hungry, and we knew that he wouldn't deny hungry men, all of whom had rifles. That night, night of October the 6th, still raining, so dark. We left with the 900 most fit men and most fit horses after we'd already ridden 28 miles. Started out in the dark. Rode through the rain, so dark that our guides got lost. Only made 7 miles that night after riding all night. Gathered back up in the morning, crossed the broad river in flood stage, put our strongest men and horses downstream to catch those who might get washed out of the saddle. Didn't lose a single man coming across that river. Found out that Ferguson was on a mountain, Little Kings Mountain in South Carolina. We surrounded that mountain because he wasn't expecting us. First shot was fired at 3 o'clock. And that shot, you've heard the shot that changed the world at Concord and Lexington. This was a shot that changed the entire course of the American Revolutionary War. 3 o'clock, one of his sentries saw us, fired a shot, the battle was on. An hour and 5 minutes later, those rough men that had ridden 58 miles in a day and a half after being in the saddle for 2 weeks with minimal food to eat, defeated Tory army of Patrick Ferguson. Every single man he had was either killed or captured. Ferguson did not survive the battle. And when I say that changed the entire course of the Revolutionary War, a lot of times in history classes you'll get dates, you'll get who did what, so forth. But why is this important? Why is this little battle that happened in the backcountry of South Carolina, Kings Mountain, is not a national battlefield? It is a military park. And do you know why it's not a national battlefield? Because we were not military. We were volunteers. Every last one of us was a volunteer. Did not have military commanders. Yeah, a lot of us had experience, but we were not part of the Continental Army. So, the National Park Service, in their wisdom, doesn't even recognize Kings Mountain as a battlefield in the name. But what that little battle did, talked about Ferguson being a recruiter. At Gilberttown, where we just missed him, there were over 500 men that came in one day to take protection of the king because they knew who was going to win this war, and it wasn't the Americans. That little battle in the backcountry of South Carolina drove Cornwallis out. I've got an original newspaper at home where the letters from the British said there were over 5,000 of those crazed backcountry men, as opposed to the 900 who were actually there. He had to retreat, and that gave George Washington time to appoint the person he wanted to appoint, General Greene. And we like to say that General Greene never won a battle, but he won the Revolutionary War because he drove Cornwallis out of the backcountry. Kings Mountain gave Greene enough time. Washington essentially told him, go find yourself an army. I have no men, no material, and no money to give you. And he did. Small challenge that any one of you could take on today, right? But these are the rough men And I come from a long line of these rough men. My grandfather, great-great-great-grandfather, John Pemberton, according to some information in the 18th century secretary at home, he received a head wound. That's why I say, by the grace of God, I am here today. We have been in Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War. My great-grandfather was wounded twice, had 3 horses shot out from under him. By the grace of God, I am here today. World War I, World War II, Korea, I'm Vietnam. By the grace of God, I am here today. But all of those rough men who go out to protect, about all voluntarily now. At one time there was such a thing as a draft. We now have Veterans Day. And unfortunately, or fortunately from a farmer's perspective and a horse person's perspective, we're having rain today, which makes the grass grow, but it interfered with the flags and the displays around the circle. But just a little bit about Veterans Day. Was originally known as Armistice Day in recognition of when the guns fell silent in the 11th hour of the 11th day, November 1918. So tomorrow, at the 11th hour, take a moment and remember all of the veterans who have put their lives on the line, that people may stay safe in their beds. In 1954, U.S. changed the name to Veterans Day to honor the World War II and Korean War veterans. It now honors all who have served. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. And there was one over here. Don't remember which one. Thank you. How many of you know the symbolism of a red poppy? Several of you nodding. Good. You think you can't have an influence because you're just a single person who doesn't have a whole lot of means or money? Well, in 1918, a young American woman by the name of Monia Bell Mitchell was so moved by Canadian War's poet work in Flanders Field that she wrote a poem of her own and went out to Wanenacres in New York and bought 24 poppies and presented them. To veterans. It wasn't but several years later that General Blackjack Pershing found out about the poppies. And tomorrow, you will see a lot of veterans organizations with poppies. That is in commemoration of every veteran who has served. One woman, a small gesture, changed the entire world. So, think about how each and every one of you are going to go change the entire world. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to all who participated in the Veterans Day service, and thank you, veterans, for your service. There will be lunch in the dining hall at 11:30, sponsored by the Student Veterans Association for any veterans who would like to attend, and we thank you for coming out this morning, and have a wonderful day. You're dismissed.